that you hear it.
This is Words Aptly Spoken, which comes from Proverbs 25:11. The word aptly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The written word is a precious treasure. We want to preserve written knowledge for God's glory and as an anchor to the history of the church and its classical conversations. We hope to encourage the reading of words and of the word.
So, welcome to Words Aptly Spoken, where normally Jennifer Courtney, Timothy Knotts, and I discuss books from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum, but today we're welcoming Stephanie Meter. It is Wednesday, April 3rd, 2024, and I'm Lee Bortons. Stephanie's our curriculum developer for Classical Conversations Multimedia, one of a handful of really great writers, and we know literature is your favorite, so thank you for joining us this month. Tim, why don't you tell us what we're talking about?
Yeah, new month, new lineup of some great things to talk about. So this month, in April, we're talking about the Challenge A literature, which is exciting stuff. I love this level and these books. So today we're going to be talking about A Door in the Wall by Marguerite De Angeli. Next week, we'll talk about Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. And later in the month, we'll visit Crispin, Cross of Lead, and The Magician's Nephew.
Those are all favorites of so many people, not just people in Classical Conversations. So if you want to hear what some of our favorites are, you can go to my YouTube channel at Lee Bortons and access all of our past episodes of our Words Aptly Spoken podcast, as well as you can go to leebortons.com and see the archives for both purchasing books that we've already discussed, as well as the calendar of what's upcoming. Excuse me. So, Tim, why don't you tell us, just introduce what we're doing, because I'm coughing.
While Lee catches her breath. So Challenge A is a really big year for a lot of families. For those of you who may not be intimately familiar with all of CC's programs, Challenge A is the program that students who are generally around 12 years old begin embarking on. It's their first day-long program. And the first time students get their hands on their very own guide, which is an exciting thing and a little intimidating for some of them, but they get their feet under them really fast. So every year has its own theme in literature. So what's the theme of the Challenge A literature, Lee, and why is Door in the Wall part of the curriculum in this year?
Yeah, that's just a question a lot of people don't know about, is that we do have kind of a theme that the literature as well as the other strands are based around. And so Challenge A, which follows Essentials, which is attending, goes from attending to ownership. That if you pay attention to all those diagramming sentences you diagram, maybe now you can start kind of owning your education a little bit more because you've learning how to see. So we're hoping our children will use the curriculum we've developed to both see the world better and to pay better attention. Well, by paying better attention to it, as well as then going, I can do that. I can build confidence and I can be competent. And so this book is such a great fit because it's about a boy of that age, 12, 13, 14 years old, who is in a very dire predicament. And he finds out he can do things nobody would have thought he could do. And so it fits right into that challenge of owning the life that you've been given and your responsibilities to both your family and to the Lord. And I think that's one of the reasons I love all the coming of age books that we have, is it's really hard to not think everything's about you. And all these books open up to a character who's just like the rest of us and finds out that life's better lived if they include others.
Yeah, this isn't a very old book. It's a 20th century book. But a lot of people view it as an old book. I think maybe because it has some older fashioned kind of language in it, and it's in a setting from a long time ago. And Lee, I know you do love this book in general, but you love it to the point where I understand that you even bought a signed copy of this book. So as the founder of CC, you have a particular investment in certain kinds of books. Why invest in something like a signed first edition of this?
Yeah, so there's only so many places in the world that you can put your money into and know that it's going to just enlighten and encourage a whole generation of believers and readers and the people that we hang around with. And so I really liked finding signed first edition copies of children's books in general, They're much cheaper than adult signed editions, and so it makes something that's an affordable gift that we then give to the Classical Conversations has a kind of hall of art. And so we have original artwork as well as we have some of these first editions to remind ourselves that as keeper of the books, there's beauty in so many ways, and each book we offer is in itself a piece of art. And so just reminding folks of that. And I think one of the reasons it feels old is because now De Angeli, I think you said it right. I think I usually say it wrong, but she was born in 1889. So it is kind of an archaic feel compared to what would seem like a newer book, as well as it is a medieval times setting. And so that lends to its age also.
Yeah. Stephanie, I've got this lovely little hardback version of the book. I don't know which one which one you read out of, but it has some really lovely art to it. But in this edition, there's an introduction by the author's son, Ted. And in it, he says she was astonished that anyone would think her work superior enough to win the Newbery Medal. Can you tell us a little bit about the author and maybe what else she wrote?
Yes. So she wrote and illustrated 28 of her own books. So she's a very remarkable lady. She also started singing professionally at age 15 for some local churches. They paid her a little bit, which was fun. Then as an adult, she illustrated Sunday school papers for a while. So she wasn't a professional author or a professional illustrator. But her Sunday school illustrations were beautiful, and she eventually got approached by a publisher to start writing and illustrating for children's books. And so she wrote about culturally diverse characters. In 1946, she published Bright April, which is a children's book addressing race issues, which was really uncommon for that time. She also wrote stories about families during the Great Depression, Polish mining family living in Pennsylvania, an Amish family, a Quaker family. And she likes to write books about people with physical handicaps like we see in The Door in the Wall, because she was so passionate about people respecting each other and loving all types of people for who they are, and trying to inspire her readers to show compassion and recognize everybody's gifts. And she lived to be 98. So a ripe old age of loving and writing books.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
There must be something to that because I think of Lois Lowry, who's equally prolific, about half a decade younger than she is, and she's now in her 90s and still going at it. So everybody take up literature writing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to imagine there is something about that with the active mind and imagination and that being part of staying sort of vigorous into older age. So we've already heard a couple little tidbits about the contents of this book. Lee, you mentioned that it's set in the Middle Ages, and Stephanie, that was a boy who's got some disabilities. So I wanted to just quickly give a sort of a synopsis of the overall picture of the book. I'm not going to tell all the story because there's some parts of it that are really lovely and should be a surprise when you encounter it for the first time if you haven't read it before. But so that we can talk about the whole thing, our later conversation will be a little bit about theme, and I don't want people to feel like they're left out by not knowing the plot of the book, since we won't get to read the whole of it together. But it's about a young boy. His name is Robin. He's lives in England during the Middle Ages, and in fact, right around the time of the Black Death. So the great bubonic plague is going on. His father is called off to fight in a war against the Scotsmen on behalf of England, and his mother is called away to become lady in waiting to the Queen, leaving Robin in the care of some faithful servants. But when we meet him at the beginning of the book, he has fallen ill and lost the use of his legs. And the servant who's caring for him gets angry with him because he's being very ungracious and unkind to her, and she leaves, and we find out later ends up contracting the Black Death. The other servant who's supposed to come and take him to a place where he's going to be the ward of another powerful noble is waylaid and wounded, and so he's left alone in his family home. And sort of unexpectedly, a a friar, Brother Luke, shows up, having heard of his plight, and takes him away to the monastery where Brother Luke lives, and works with him a little bit to strengthen him both in body and in mind, and then eventually takes him to that place where he was supposed to go, this other castle where he was going to be the ward. Um, and uh, through some adventures along the way, he arrives successfully, and eventually that castle gets beset by the marauding Welsh. So there's some things going on historically that are pretty interesting in this, that the English are fighting against the Welsh and the Scots. And as was already mentioned, he sort of rises beyond all expectations to accomplish some things that are really a big deal. So we won't go into what, because again, read the book. It's great. If you sit down and read it, it'll probably take you an hour or two. It's not a very long book. So what other books in our curriculum, and especially maybe Challenge A, have some similar ideas, or what does this book remind you of?
You know, I always get the A and B books confused. So it's been it's been over 15 years since I had a kid in A. But it immediately reminds me also of the well, either the two of our books from World War II, The Number of the Stars or the Hiding Place, where children are asked to do things they shouldn't have to do, but they find the ability to do them anyway.
That's a great connection, Lee.
Mhm. The other one that this reminds me of is Crispin. And I think part of that is because Crispin also takes place in those Middle Ages or around the plague time. Um, and it's a coming of age story a little bit as well. And Crispin is sort of underprivileged. He has some things working against him, just like Robin does. And then they also both have a helper. Robin has brother Luke, and then Crispin has Bear, if I'm remembering that correctly. So that kind of reminds me of it. And then the way that Robin's mind gets opened by reading gave me shades of Carry On, Mr. Bowditch, possibly, just in that learning, kind of opening the world to him in a new way.
Yeah. It reminds me of Secret Garden, where at the beginning, the main character in there is left alone because there's a
Oh, yeah.
sickness and people die all around, and is whisked away to a new place, where there's sort of a new set of expectations. Only it's sort of a combination of Colin in there too, who's the sickly boy who learns to rise up and do things that he never thought he could in Secret Garden. So there's definitely some great thematic overlap and even some plot that can be compared among a lot of these great books that we read.
Yeah, I have a question that's not in your list. You just made me think about. So these older books, when there is the conflict or tragedy or whatever the child needs to rise through, they a lot of times death is part of what's going on. And I think it's just occurred to me, it's probably because people didn't live as long then. So now when they're trying in a modern book written since the last 30 years, instead of having death, because people don't die, we live so long, the conflicts end up being emotionally damaging in a way that's harder to heal, like, divorces or family distress or drugs or alcohol. They're things that the books that we read, the majority of things aren't that child's fault or their family's fault. They're there to be strong together versus now trying to deal with things where your family is causing you the problems rather than supporting you. Is that unfair? I read
Mm.
so little new children's literature.
Yeah, it's interesting.
What do you mean by unfair? Like,
Is my assessment unfair? Do you think
oh,
I'm misrepresenting?
huh. I hadn't thought about this.
Well, that may be something for our listeners to think about. What is the
Yeah.
difference between these pre-1960s classics that we read and the more modern books that are out there?
Yeah, it's interesting. You think about a lot of those early children's books, in the English tradition, like E. Nesbit books.
Mhm.
The children tend to be left a lot to their own devices, right?
Hmm.
That there's usually adults around who are helpful or intermittently available, but But in the modern world, right, parents are always around. They're sort of hovering around the children, and the children don't have the time and the space to get into the sort of adventures
Mm.
that you read about in these older stories. Stephanie, it makes me think a little bit about what you wrote in one of your forewords to one of the
Oh.
new Copper Lodge books this last year about playing at being orphans or lost children, right?
Yes, that was for Secret Garden. Yeah. Well, and I think that although Lee, you're right, it's usually less like death or world events that happen in modern stories. The kids are still left to their own devices a lot, and I
Mhm,
think that that really appeals to young adults because they want to be able to explore their personhood and their decision making by themselves,
mhm,
without having their parents around them.
mhm,
But I don't know about the
Mm,
sort of act of God versus their own fault is
mhm.
interesting.
Yeah. Well, and so that's why it's a fair assessment too.
Mhm.
Because, if you don't have a conflict and there's something to rise over, and children are going to be more interested in books that have a conflict they can relate to. So I'm not necessarily saying it's all negative. I'm just
Yeah.
thinking about when people ask about what's the difference between these earlier coming of age books and the older ones. Even like you think of something, Dickens, which is so popular, or anything from the 1800s where or even the late 1700s, like more of the Victorian era where children were expected to die. So you think of like Hans Christian Andersen and the Little Match Girl and books like that. So it's just really interesting. To me, it's interesting to figure out why the children's genres have the conflicts that they have and
mhm,
how to compare them.
I I wonder if authors think that having a sort of an act of God conflict um is more noble to rise against. I don't know. Like if you made the problem for yourself, then obviously get over it. Like it's your job to work your way out of it.
Mhm,
But if something totally outside of your control and outside of your blame happens to you,
mhm,
maybe it has to show more character development to get over that, to rise above something that maybe you didn't deserve.
mhm. Because otherwise it might become a how-to book
Mhm.
rather than a moral evaluation of what are my best choices, and when they're not best, how do I deal with the consequences?
Yeah.
yeah, I think a lot of our children's literature, not of the modern era, I think a lot of our modern books deal with modern children.
Mhm,
Um, in the early 20th century and earlier, many of the stories didn't deal with sort of real life for children, even of that era. They dealt with people of an older generation or a faraway place, like you think about Treasure Island, right?
mm,
By Robert Louis Stevenson, who
mm,
wrote the story, and it was for the adventure of it that even though most children wouldn't ever have gone to see
mhm,
that way, they can still imagine it.
mm,
Um, so in this book, Door on the Wall, it's set in the Middle Ages, is written by a woman in the 20th century. So how do we use books like these that are pretty far outside of our everyday experience, certainly, or even often our sort of everyday imaginations,
mhm,
to talk about things like that,
mm,
to make them useful in conversation with our kids and not just information that they
mhm.
should absorb and then maybe write about or talk about or tell about.
Yeah, we have 3 or 4 books, not a lot of them. Door on the Wall would be one, A Gathering of Days, but 3 or 4 books where I have found that they're so simply told, whatever the era they're in, they actually almost make better stories to tell aloud to your child. In other words, you can do the summary and the synopsis and tell the story yourself because 'cause they're not super long. And so that's one thing I appreciate about this book is that my grandchildren aren't, I mean, they don't live over here, so I usually only have a few hours to read to them. And I find that I can tell the story of The Door on the Wall or tell some of the other stories that we read to them in a half hour with voices, and it keeps their interest. And so I just really, like to bring that up because sometimes parents will have children who aren't readers. Now, mine are really little, they're like all under 9. Um, and to remember that, reading aloud to them, as well as just telling stories in the car, can help them to enjoy these books too.
Yeah, is there something a little bit safe about talking to kids about something that's so distant from them.
Mm.
Like,
Yeah.
like
That's
as a
kind of,
parent. Yeah. Go ahead, Stephanie.
well, yeah, that's one of the things I was thinking about too, is that we talk a lot about literature being a way to exercise your moral imagination. So exploring choices and consequences in characters instead of in your own life it can make us read and think without being so defensive. If somebody comes at you and says, "Hey, I noticed that your temper is getting the best of you and you're throwing things. What's wrong with you?" That might not be as well received as Robin gets frustrated in the book, and does throw some tools. And a 12-year-old can look at that and say, so that's what that looks like from the outside. I have been tempted to do that or done that before. And having a story that's removed from your own life can let you get some perspective and see maybe some of your own character flaws in a way that's not so personal. And having a setting that's so removed maybe makes that even easier to do.
You also made me think about, I, I don't know, Tim, you're so good at reading with your children. Maybe you guys still do this, but I remember when our family first became Christian back in the 80s, one of the things that folks would do, my friends who would tell their homeschooled kids, oh, is that how David would deal with it? Or, oh, that wasn't what would Jesus do? That didn't come to my kids were in high school when it became a bracelet. But there were stories where we would say, who's the giant you're attacking? Or we would use biblical analogies for our stories. And the asking, not for our stories, but for asking them questions. I don't hear people doing that anymore. Do they, Tim?
Yeah, not as much. I think we have fewer stories in common to
Mm,
do that with, which is sad.
mhm,
Um, I love the fact that we have the Echoes books
mhm.
now that are fairy tales and folklore that hopefully we can read together, because then you can say, like, to a student, well, are you being a crow
Yeah.
about this? Right, we can use those shorthands, and it is a little bit disarming. It's a
Mhm,
little bit of a deflection away from the very harsh reality of criticizing,
mhm,
and a way to sort of put it onto somebody else, that you say, well, you don't want to be like this person, but you should want to be like this person.
mhm. Yeah.
uh,
Well, hopefully the books that we're reading in the curated curriculum just live up to the expectations that there's the morality side of it. They're exploring the conflict and doing it in a way that, I mean, the language should be safe as well written. And I think The Door on the Wall is, just excellent example of the book. And I'm so grateful for those authors from the past and the present who really care about the heart of the child and not just get how to survive a conflict.
yeah, great.
Yeah. Mm.
Thanks. Well, we're about halfway done with our time, so Lee, do you want to do our sponsor? Thank you.
Yeah. So we want to thank our sponsor, classicalconversationsbooks.com, where the books discussed can be purchased. We have the entire 2023 and 2024 Words Aptly Spoken calendar at my website, leebortons.com, with links to the CC book site to purchase them, as well as links to the at Lee Bortons YouTube in order to hear our previous conversations. And next week, we're going to be discussing The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. And we hope that you'll go ahead and purchase that and be able to enjoy our conversation next week. You've already heard Tim bring that up. It's definitely a favorite and has a lot of these similar themes.
Yeah, just a quick plug for that one.
Mhm.
CCMM just published a brand new edition of The Secret Garden that's out on the CC bookstore, with some lovely information in the front matter and annotations by our own Stephanie Meter here. So if you're got an old ratty copy or need a second copy or don't have one, that's a great resource to have at home.
So did you do that under the Copper Lodge branding, Stephanie?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. That's really wonderful. So you guys get publish so many things. I can't even keep up. So I appreciate all your efforts.
It is fun. It is fun. I like Secret Garden. I hadn't really revisited since Challenge A, and so I'm excited to talk
Oh,
about that one again next week. Loved it.
totally different as an adult, right? It's a book for all ages, as is Door in the Wall.
hmm I appreciate it much more now as an adult than I did when I
Mhm,
was a young person.
mhm.
Um, so now is the time where we turn our attention to some more close attention to the book at hand, a little less about the context of it. So, Stephanie, we're gonna sort of hone in a little bit on some theme issues today. And so I thought we'd dig into the first passage about the where the name of the book comes from. That's maybe sometimes a good way to start. So if you want to read that section for us, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so this comes from pretty near the beginning of the book. Brother Luke says to Robin, "Dost thou remember the long wall that is about the garden of thy father's house?" "Yes," said Robin, "of course. Why?" "Dost thou remember, too, the wall around the tower or any other wall?" Robin nodded. "Have they not all a door somewhere?" "Yes," said Robin again. "Always remember that," said the friar. "Thou hast only to follow the wall far enough, and there will be a door in it." "I will remember," Robin promised, but he wasn't sure that he knew what Brother Luke meant to say.
Mm.
So just a couple of quick observations about this before we start talking about theme stuff. I think this is great to give our 12-year-old, 13-year-old kids this lightweight introduction to some of this more archaic language, right? You'll hear the dust and thy and thou, but it's only sprinkled through. It's not like heavy duty Shakespearean English, but they're going to encounter that kind of language again and again. So this is a really good sort of gateway into that.
Yeah,
Um,
because they do read it later with Pilgrim's Progress and Shakespeare. I mean, they're going to come across that, and of course, hopefully, reading the King James version of the Bible sometime. So
yeah.
it's good.
Yeah. So Stephanie, can you tell us a little bit about how we talk about theme and sort of our Freytag's pyramid? We've looked at plot and we looked at the characters. I think today we can look at theme a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So in our Freitag's pyramid drawing, it's it's a little pyramid, and then behind the pyramid is this big circle that kind of goes through the whole thing, and it's labeled theme. So theme is a general topic that's addressed in various ways throughout the story and really supports the whole story. You should be able to find threads of the theme throughout the content. Another way to define theme is to think of it as the question that troubles the author or the main character. And then the story's moral, if there is one, is the answer to that question. So the theme might be, what is the door in the wall? That's the question that Robin is struggling with early on. But sometimes there are multiple themes, as we might talk about later. So it's a little bit subjective, but readers can see what questions the author seems to be getting you to ask, or what question the main character is wrestling with. Sometimes the theme also has to do with the story's conflict. If we have a character who's trying to achieve something, a lot of times the resolution to that conflict will tell us something about the theme.
I like how you said the author or the main character. Tell me what you meant by that.
Yes. So sometimes the main character is getting the reader to ask the same questions as he, the main character, is. But sometimes the main character is either oblivious or not actually developing into a good character, and you might be inspired to ask some questions about this character's development, like, oh, is this a bad person? Is revenge a bad thing or a good thing? And maybe these are questions that the character isn't wrestling with, but you can tell that the author is asking you as a reader to ponder this.
Mhm. I would think that would be, well, you're right, way more than I do on this level. Is it easier or harder to be sympathetic with your main character to write it?
I've always personally found it easy to sympathize, but I think that's just because I've been trying to write the same book my entire life. So I'm very familiar with this one character. I think probably authors, I would imagine it's hard to write a main character if you don't sympathize with him at all.
Mhm.
And even in villains, I think there's a little bit of us. I think we can find ourselves in most characters at least a little bit.
Yeah, I'm always frustrated when I read books with main characters who are, like you said, Stephanie, not necessarily developing into something evil, which I mean,
Mhm.
then you're not sympathetic really for the most part at all. But with ones who don't seem to be developing fast enough, right? They don't,
Yeah.
these coming of age stories where someone is frustratingly immature for a long
Mhm.
time and you want them to grow up and they're
Yeah.
just not doing it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
sometimes that can be a conflict. I mean, a lot of times, or maybe really more the theme, because when we think about conflict, it's usually something concrete, like, will the character be able to do this thing? But the theme could be, my goodness, is so and so ever going to grow up? I mean, what is it going to take for this person to finally realize the error of his ways?
Mhm.
Yeah, good. So in this book, I mean, could obviously we've had just a tiny plot summary and a couple of things poking around at it, but can we come up with some things that might be a theme? And is there only one right answer, or could there be multiple
Mm.
right answers for what the theme of the
Mhm.
book is?
Well, because
So,
of it was inspired by a man who was disabled, and Marguerite just really appreciated how much he accomplished in his life. So I
mhm,
see that as the theme, that in the boy starting out, like anybody would, so frustrated with what's happened to him and not knowing where to turn. And then bit by bit, he begins to find his support network. He begins to find abilities within himself. So just the bravery and I mean, healthy people just, we whine about nothing sometimes in comparison to folks that have really so much to overcome. And so
mhm,
I thought she just really, without ever making the young man like pitiful, he's never pitiful. Maybe for a few minutes at the beginning when just all the tragedy occurs, but he very quickly becomes somebody you want to root for.
mhm. I actually have the copy that apparently was mine as a Challenge A
Aw.
student, and I can see some of my little notes in here. I'm very proud. I didn't take notes in a lot of books, but apparently I did take notes in this one. And I have a little note in here, although it is misspelled. It says perseverance. And I've highlighted some places where Robin shows perseverance throughout the book. And that's one of those buzzwords or virtues that can be a theme. So sometimes we have, forgiveness or love, and I think perseverance can be a theme.
Mhm.
And part of Robin's coming of age story is learning to persevere through his physical disability, but then also just when he makes mistakes, or isn't perfect at something, he's persevering through that and growing as a person through persevering through things that are his fault, things that are not his fault, and just learning that steadfastness.
Hmm. Are there times when we might think that there is a theme, that we know what the theme is, and then sometime partway through reading a book, we discover that maybe that isn't the theme and there's something else that emerges?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah. I'm trying to think of a good
probably.
example.
Me
Well,
too.
like some ways, like to Kill a Mockingbird in some ways has that occur.
Mm.
A new one, where the Crawdad sings has, and that's not in our curriculum, but boy, oh boy, is it a surprise ending, and it makes you go, "What was I reading? Do I now I gotta go read it again."
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think To Kill a Mockingbird is a great example because I
Mhm,
remember reading it and thinking and really sympathizing with the kids, right?
mhm,
Mm,
Um, and feeling like, oh, they're gonna do something really good. They're gonna be the hero of the story. And then you get to closer to the end, you realize, oh wait, really this is a story about Atticus.
mhm.
And it's being told by the kids through the kids' eyes. But the themes of the book aren't really about the kids at all. And I had to sort of realign my whole thinking about the book as I read it.
I don't think that's something younger readers catch the first time through, Tim, do you think? I think
No. No, I think it's sometimes, and maybe it's true, we pick up different themes
mm,
as we read a book over and over at different times of our own lives. There's
Yeah.
something about it that sympathizes or something we know we need to learn.
Yes, I think so. When you just said at different times in your life, The Great Gatsby is one book that for whatever reason I have read so many times that I have experience with reading it at different phases in my life. Um, and I pick out different things every time. I mean, in high school, I thought it was beautiful and kind of inspiring, and now I don't quite know why I saw that in it originally. The last time I read it, it was a downer, and I think the title is now totally ironic, and it's just, yes, so it's completely different. And I think you're right, maybe, with multiple readings you can find different themes, but multiple readings at different life stages I think make you draw out different themes too.
mhm. That's why C.S. Lewis said the sign of a literate person is someone who reads the same books over and over and over again, because he knew that. And so sometimes parents will ask us, or they'll make a comment, my child's already read that book. And unfortunately, the four of us would go, so? Read it again because we know how much joy they're going to get in a totally different way. So
Yeah.
and that's what we're trying to develop in classical conversation. So we have a lot of those echo books are very similar, very because they're short fairy tales, right for that age group. So it kind of builds an ability to look for themes or to look for plot or look for character because of their simplicity. And there's nothing wrong with reading them over and over again. And then even this book, The Door on the Wall, it's really probably at the level of a high, at a fourth grade level who can read really, really well. But those themes, like you just said, are so deep. It's good to read this again when you're 12, 13 years old.
Oh, we're 48.
Yeah.
Um, so so Stephanie, you talked about finding themes by asking yourself, what is the author wrestling with? What kind of issues are there that the author is trying to show you, or maybe that the main character is revealing through his or her own thoughts or words. Um, is there are there other ways, techniques to try and locate a theme in a book, for someone who maybe looks at it and says, well, the main character seems awfully confused and I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you can ask, sometimes you can ask character focused questions too, like what seems important to the character or what seems important to the author. You can think about author worldview a little bit and trying to get to theme. Um, what questions is the main character asking? What questions are being asked of the main character? So kind of just digging into the interiority of the characters a little bit, and really focusing on what seems important to the character or what they're struggling with.
Mm,
When you also have in this book particularly, you have his nursemaid at first, then you have Brother Luke, and then eventually you have the man at the castle, and then finally you have his, the parents. And the questions they ask this young boy, I think, pull out the themes too.
mm. Good. Yeah. Questions that are asked in the book. This one has some repetition. So the idea of the door in the wall comes up over and over again through the book. It's not just the title, or even in that passage we looked at. We have it, Brother Luke says, reading is another door in the wall, or crutches can be a door in the wall, or someone else says, if if we do what we're able, a door will always open to something else.
Mhm.
Um, and then sort of in a example rather than words, eventually Robin sneaks his way out of the castle through a little door in the castle wall, right? So there's sort of this imagery as well as the words that are going on. So sometimes those repeated ideas also can help us to highlight a theme that we might have not seen so much in the character themselves, but maybe in the action or in the dialogue. Um, Lee, do you want to read us another short passage?
Sure. He felt so strong. This is referring to Robin. He felt so strong that he was sure he would soon be able to get up and walk. He began to whistle and set to work again. For a long time, only these homely sounds were heard in the garden close, for the monks did not talk at their work. Then it happened. The sharp chisel slipped and cut a gash across the longer piece of the cross. It broke. Away flew the other piece, as far as Robin could throw it, and after it went the chisel, narrowly missing Brother Matthew's head. Robin's face was drawn into a black cloud of anger, and if he'd been able, he would have stormed out of the garden, but he was bound to stay where he was, so he took out his anger in words. Treacherous, misguided tool, he shouted. I'll have no more of you. Brother Matthew looked up in astonishment. "'Tis not the tool that is at fault, but thine unskilled hands," he said quietly. I should have opened with letting people know he was whittling. Yeah.
Yeah. There's one more line there, Lee.
Oh, my screen got small. I'm sorry, I'll read the second. So Brother Matthew looked up in astonishment. "'Tis not the tool that is at fault, but thine unskilled hands," he said quietly. "If thou art to learn to use it, patience and care of better teachers than a bad temper."
Yeah.
So it's important.
Yeah, so we've already brought up that theme of perseverance that Stephanie even noted when she was a 12-year-old student. Um, why is this sort of, and we see this sort of vignette over and over in these kinds of books, right? Where someone's trying something, they have these expectations and then they get frustrated. Um, why is that such a powerful theme
Mm.
for us as people, and maybe especially for those teenage, early teenage years?
I think it's relatable partly. Like we've probably all been there when we've been frustrated with a task that we are doing. And this even happens to Robin when he's kind of almost done with this whittling project. He's been working on it for a long time. And I think most of us have gotten to almost the finish line in something and then had it all fall apart. And so it can be kind of encouraging to see somebody else go through it and persevere. But at the same time, I had mentioned earlier, it gives us a chance to see from the outside what it looks like when you do just let your temper get the better of you. And so encouraging that you're not the only person who's been in that position, but also it gives you a chance to see what it looks like when you just throw a fit.
Well, and so many times um those tween years are so much like toddler years, but obviously at a larger level. You know, the toddler's frustrated usually because of language skills. They can't just quite say what they want to say. But that young person that we're talking about, they can't quite do yet what they want to do. So this is a simple task, and he's learning how to carve wood or play an instrument or whatever it is. But it's relatable to the child who, just wishes that he could have a later curfew, or that he could stay at his friend's house one more day, or that he could drive the truck, or whatever it happens to be. And that it's really better not to throw the thing at your sister that you're mad at her about. So, it's just, and then he also doesn't do this a whole lot, but you can feel his frustration. That she's such a good writer. You can feel his frustration as he goes from that like acknowledgement, I'm going to be at the monastery, to what the later adventures has for him, and he has a lot of skills to learn because he's lost his legs. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think he wants to sort of proverbially get up and run when it comes
mhm,
to whittling. And they're all of a sudden, no, slow down. You have to master the little things first. And likewise, with wanting to get up and literally run, he wants to do that. And they're trying to help him with sort of the piecemeal steps toward that as much as he's able to do. But we're almost out of time. I want to read us one more passage because this
sure.
is really my favorite. This is the sort of one of the most poignant moments and important lessons from the book that I think is a lovely, um, maybe bringing together of a couple of the other themes or the underlying themes of the book. So this is what is said to Robin a little later in the book. A fine and beautiful life lies before thee, because thou hast a lively mind and a good wit. Thine arms are very strong and sturdy. Swimming hath helped to make them so, but only because thou hast had the will to do it. Fret not, my son. None of us is perfect. It is better to have crooked legs than a crooked spirit. We can only do the best we can with what we have. That, after all, is the measure of success, what we do with what we have.
Great, great words to end on. Is there something you want to talk about, or are we
Yeah,
finished?
if we just for one minute, like
Yeah.
how do we take that from that theme from this story and really help
Hmm.
our students to learn from that theme and not just see it.
Mhm. So basically the theme that we do with what we have. Yeah, so
Yeah.
that it goes back to the Garden of Eden and contentment with God and obeying him. I mean,
Yeah. And diligence, right? To
mhm,
work with a will at the
mhm,
things that we have to do.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I liked the line of it's better to have crooked legs than a crooked spirit. I liked
Mhm.
that a lot. I remember being sort of frustrated by things like this as a student when I was this age, but it really does strike me as beautiful now. Um, and the measure of success to do what we do with what we have, because that is what we're trying to do. And it reminds me of the Gandalf line. We don't get to make all the decisions, but all we have is we get to decide what's best to do with the time that's given to us. And so the time that's given to us and the tools and the situations and our circumstances, a lot of that is out of our control. And so we just do the best with what we have. And that is the measure of success.
Good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Tim and Stephanie, and I appreciate so much that your just love of words and of the word. So we'll see you all next week.
Thanks. Bye,
Thanks.
Lee.
Bye.